The afternoon wind cut through the prairie like a freshly sharpened blade. Thin snow scattered across the buffalo grass like salt on a wound. Grace Moran clutched her worn canvas bag close to her chest, her hands trembling from the cold and from the eviction notice that had arrived 3 days after Thomas's funeral. The mine owner's letter was brief and merciless. The company house was needed for the next shift foreman, and widows had no place in a mining operation. The abandoned wagon track leading toward Dry Willow stretched before them, rutted and unforgiving. Grace pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as 12-year-old Liza stumbled beside her, their few possessions wrapped in a quilt that had once graced their marriage bed. The wheels of passing freight wagons had left deep grooves in the frozen earth, and Grace couldn't help but think how the landscape itself seemed carved by hardship. Caleb Whitlock appeared through the swirling snow like a specter, his dark coat dusted white, his eyes the color of winter sky. He reined in his sorrel mare when he spotted the two figures huddled beneath a lone cottonwood, its bare branches offering no shelter from the biting wind. For a moment, he simply sat there, taking in the sight of them, a woman in mourning black, and a girl too young to understand why the world had turned so cruel. "Storm's getting worse," he said finally, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man who chose his words carefully. "The kitchen at my ranch is warm. You're welcome to wait it out there." Grace lifted her chin, pride warring with necessity. She'd heard of the Whitlocks. Everyone in 3 counties knew old Samuel Whitlock ran the largest cattle operation this side of the Powder River. His son was said to be a shadow of the old man, quiet where Samuel was loud, cautious where his father was bold. Some called him weak. Looking at him now, Grace saw something else, a steadiness in his gaze that reminded her of deep water. "We couldn't impose," she managed, though her teeth chattered around the words. "It's not an imposition to offer shelter in a storm," Caleb replied. He dismounted smoothly and helped them onto his horse, walking alongside as they made their slow way across the frozen prairie. The Whitlock Ranch materialized through the snow like something from a fever dream. A 2-story log house with real glass windows, long cattle barns that seemed to stretch forever, and fence lines battered but holding against the relentless wind. It spoke of permanence in a land where most things were temporary, of roots sunk deep enough to weather any storm. Samuel Whitlock stood on the porch, his steel-gray beard ruffled by the wind, his eyes hard as flint when they landed on Grace. "What's this, then?" he demanded, looking from his son to the bedraggled women. "Neighbors caught in the storm," Caleb said evenly. "They'll stay until it passes." The old man's mouth tightened. Everyone knew his opinions on widows and charity cases. They were trouble, especially during calving season when every hand was needed and every resource precious. But something in his son's stance, the way Caleb positioned himself slightly between the women and his father, made Samuel step aside. The ranch kitchen was everything Grace's mining shack had never been. Warm, spacious, with a massive iron stove that radiated heat like a small sun. The Mexican cook, Rosa, took one look at them and began ladling beef stew into bowls without being asked. Grace accepted the food with murmured thanks, aware of every eye in the room upon her. Ranch hands drifted in and out, stealing curious glances at the widow and her sister. "Thank you," Grace said quietly to Caleb as he poured coffee from a blue enamel pot. "We'll be on our way as soon as the storm breaks." "Where will you go?" The question was gentle, but it cut deep. Grace's fingers tightened around the warm mug. "My husband, Thomas, he bought a piece of land out by Mule Creek, just before—" She couldn't finish. Just before the cave-in. Just before the mountain swallowed him whole and spat out nothing but sorrow. Outside, the wind howled like something alive and hungry. Cattle lowed mournfully from the barns, and Grace could hear the hands calling to each other as they worked to keep the herd safe. This was the language of the West endurance measured in small victories against an indifferent landscape. Caleb led them to a small room off the kitchen that served as quarters for seasonal workers. It was sparse but clean, with 2 narrow beds and a washstand. "Rest," he said. "We'll talk about Mule Creek tomorrow." That night, as Liza slept fitfully beside her, Grace lay awake listening to the storm rage outside. The house groaned and settled around her, and she could hear the distant sound of Caleb's voice as he organized the night watch. She thought about Thomas, about the land he'd bought with their meager savings, about the deed tucked safely in her bag. It was all they had left. 40 acres of scrub brush and a seasonal creek that might or might not run come spring. In the darkness, she allowed herself one moment of pure despair. Then, as she'd done every night since Thomas died, she pushed it down deep where it couldn't touch Liza. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. Tonight, they were warm and fed. And in this harsh country, that was its own kind of miracle. Come morning, the snow lay thick as a winter blanket, obscuring the road back to town. Caleb appeared at breakfast, his face drawn from a night spent tending stock. He poured coffee thick as tar and studied Grace across the scarred wooden table. "I know Mule Creek," he said finally. "That land hasn't been worked in years. The previous owner gave up after the drought of '83. Grace met his gaze steadily. "It's what we have." Something shifted in his expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. "Then we'd better go take a look at it. See what needs doing before you and Liza move out there." Samuel Whitlock snorted from his place by the stove. "Fool's errand. Helping folks who can't help themselves." But Caleb was already reaching for his coat, and Grace understood that this was how things were decided in the Whitlock household, not through words but through actions. Small rebellions measured in kindness. As they prepared to leave, Grace caught sight of herself in the mirror by the door. Her face was thinner than it had been, her dark hair severely pulled back, her gray eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She looked like what she was, a woman running on nothing but determination and the fierce need to protect what remained of her family. "Ready?" Caleb asked, and she nodded. Outside, the world had been transformed by snow, made clean and terrible and new. As they rode out toward Mule Creek, Grace allowed herself to hope that transformation might be possible for more than just the landscape. Behind them, the Whitlock ranch grew smaller, but somehow she knew their story was just beginning to unfold across this unforgiving canvas of white. The trail to Mule Creek wound through gray sage and juniper, the winter bare branches scratching at the pale sky. The snow had melted in patches, revealing brown grass that crunched beneath the horses' hooves. Grace rode behind Caleb on a gentle mare, Liza clinging to her waist, as they picked their way through the rough country that would either become their salvation or their grave. The land appeared suddenly as they crested a small rise 40 acres of neglect and possibility. A low-slung cabin squatted near a line of dying willows, its roof partially caved in, the door hanging askew on leather hinges. The well stood behind it, the wooden frame weathered silver, a bucket dangling from a frayed rope. Around the chicken coop, wolf tracks crisscrossed in the mud, telling their own story of hunger and abandonment. Grace dismounted slowly, her legs stiff from the ride. She walked to the cabin and pushed open the door, revealing a single room with a dirt floor and gaps in the walls where the chinking had fallen away. Mice had built nests in the corners, and snow had drifted through the broken roof to form small pyramids on what remained of a rough-hewn table. From her bag, she pulled out Thomas's wooden box. Inside lay the deed to this land, water-stained and precious, along with a hand-drawn map showing the underground spring that fed Mule Creek. The hope in those pencil marks seemed fragile as frost, but it was all she had. Mrs. Moran. Grace turned to find a rider approaching. Harlan Pike, deputy sheriff of Dry Willow. His smile never reached his eyes, which were pale and calculating as a snake's. He dismounted with practiced ease, his hand resting casually on the colt at his hip. "Heard you were moving out this way," Pike said, his gaze sliding over the dilapidated cabin. "Shame about your husband." Mining's dangerous work. He paused, letting the words settle like dust. This lands in the path of the proposed railroad extension. The smart thing would be to sell now, while you can still get something for it. Save yourself and the girl a heap of trouble. Caleb stepped forward, positioning himself between Pike and the women. He didn't raise his voice, didn't posture, just stood there solid as granite. Mrs. Moran hasn't asked for advice about her property. Pike's smile widened. Just being neighborly. Whitlock, your daddy know you're out here playing protector to every stray that wanders by. My father knows I'm checking on neighbors. Caleb replied evenly. Something about Christian duty, if I recall the sermon right. The two men stood there, measuring each other in the way of the West, where violence always simmered just beneath the surface of civility. Finally, Pike touched the brim of his hat mockingly. Ladies, Whitlock, you think on what I said. Mrs. Moran wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen out here, so far from town. After he rode off, the silence stretched tight as barbed wire. A flock of crows erupted from the willows, their cries harsh against the winter air. Grace found her hands were trembling, but not from cold. He threatened us, Liza whispered, her young face pale with understanding. No, Caleb said quietly. He warned you. There's a difference, though both are meant to frighten. He turned to Grace. The railroad's been buying up water rights all along the eastern edge of the territory. Pike's got his hand in it somehow. Him and some investors from back east. That evening, back at the Whitlock Ranch, word had already spread. Samuel Whitlock cornered his son in the barn, his voice carrying over the restless movement of horses. You're bringing trouble to this house, the old man said. That woman's got nothing but a broken-down claim and a target on her back. We've got our own concerns. Cattle to market, hands to pay. Since when do we turn our backs on neighbors? Caleb asked. Since neighbors started bringing railroad speculators and crooked lawmen to our door. Samuel shot back. You want to play hero. Boy heroes get themselves and everyone around them killed in this country. In town the next day, Grace felt the weight of eyes upon her as she traded her mother's pearl buttons for flour and salt. The general store was thick with whispers. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been friendly enough at church, now busied herself with boat goods when Grace approached. Only old Mrs. Chen, who ran the laundry, pressed a small bag of rice into Grace's hands with a knowing look. That night, Caleb appeared at their cabin, for Grace had insisted on moving there despite its condition, needing to claim it as home. He carried new tar paper, a hammer, and a determined expression. Can't have you freezing, he said simply, and began patching the roof by lantern light. Grace worked beside him, holding boards while he hammered. Why are you doing this? She asked. Your father's right. We're nothing but trouble for you. Caleb paused, considering. My mother died in a blizzard when I was 8, got caught out checking on a sick neighbor. Pa never forgave himself for not going with her, for choosing the easy path of staying warm. He resumed hammering, each strike deliberate. I learned young that in this land, we're all bound together by more than fence lines. You turn away from that truth, you might as well be dead already. Liza appeared in the doorway with tin cups of coffee, her small face serious in the lamplight. She'd taken to hanging Thomas's wooden cross on the wall and polishing it each night, a ritual that broke Grace's heart with its quiet faith. Mr. Whitlock, Liza said carefully, do you think they'll really try to take our land? Caleb accepted the coffee gratefully, his hands rough from work. I think they'll try, he said honestly. But trying and succeeding are different things. Outside, wind moaned through the gaps they hadn't yet fixed, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. Grace thought about the life she'd imagined with Thomas, Sunday dinners and children's laughter, a garden heavy with vegetables, years stretching ahead like a well-marked trail. That future had died with him in the mine, but here in this broken cabin, with tar paper and determination. Perhaps another future was taking shape. "My husband spoke of you once," Grace said suddenly. "Said Caleb Whitlock was the only rancher who'd pay fair wages to miners' sons during Roundup. Said you were different from your father." "Different enough to disappoint him regularly," Caleb replied, but there was no bitterness in it, only acceptance. They worked until midnight, fixing what they could. When Caleb finally prepared to leave, Grace walked him to his horse. The moon had risen, turning the landscape silver and strange. "I haven't thanked you properly," she began, but he shook his head. "No thanks needed, just—" He paused, choosing his words. "Be careful. Pike doesn't make idle threats, and the men he works for have deep pockets and shallow consciences." As she watched him ride away, Grace felt something shift inside her chest, not her grief for Thomas, which would always be there, but something else, a tiny flame of possibility. Fragile as the spring her husband had mapped, but perhaps strong enough to survive if carefully tended. Inside, Liza had fallen asleep at the table, her head pillowed on her arms. Grace covered her with their one good blanket and sat by the window, watching clouds scud across the moon. Tomorrow she would start teaching the local children their letters. 3 families had already asked, desperate for education in this frontier where schools were scarcer than water. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The land outside lay still and vast, holding its secrets close, somewhere beneath the frozen earth. According to Thomas's map, water waited, just as somewhere beneath her grief, Grace suspected, life waited too patient and enduring as the prairie grass that would green again come spring. February arrived with bitter winds and a sky like dirty wool. The Whitlock cattle grew gaunt despite the hay hauled from distant stacks, and the Powder River dropped so low that ice scraped against stones that hadn't seen air in 20 years. It was the kind of winter that broke ranches and dreams with equal indifference. News traveled fast along the frontier telegraph of gossip and concern. A group of Eastern speculators operating under the name Avery Pike and Associates had been buying up land around water sources, offering whiskey and promises to desperate homesteaders. They'd thrown up a temporary wooden bridge across Mule Creek, claiming it was for surveying purposes. But everyone knew possession was 9/10 of the law in country where law was scarce. At church on Sunday, Grace endured the whispers of the town women. "A pretty widow is still a widow. Mrs." Patterson murmured to her circle, loud enough to carry. Grace kept her smile fixed, her hands steady as she accepted a loaf of bread from Mrs. Martinez, one of the few who still treated her with warmth. The Mexican woman pressed Grace's hand briefly, understanding in her dark eyes. She too knew what it meant to be an outsider. Caleb had taken to bringing books to the cabin, their covers worn soft from use. "Liza should keep up her learning," he said, setting them on the makeshift table. "Soon." Grace had fashioned rough benches from salvaged wood and invited the neighboring children, the Hendricks boys, the Martinez girls. Even shy little Emma Chen, they came carrying slates and precious stubs of chalk, hungry for words in a land that fed the body but often starved the mind. Harlan Pike appeared one Tuesday morning, his badge glinting dully in the weak sunlight. "Running a school without proper permits," he announced, scanning the circle of wide-eyed children. "That's a violation of territorial education statutes." Caleb, who'd been mending harness nearby, straightened slowly. "This is private property, deputy, and last I checked, the Constitution didn't prohibit teaching children to read." Pike's hand drifted to his gun belt, a gesture meant to remind everyone of the weight behind his words. "Constitution don't mean much out here. Whitlock, you'd best remember that." That night, disaster struck. Grace woke to the sound of chickens squawking in terror. Someone had cut the wire on the coop, scattering her small flock into the darkness. She grabbed a lantern while Liza fumbled for the old shotgun Thomas had left. They stumbled into the freezing night, following the sounds of distress. Grace caught glimpses of her hens disappearing into the sage, their white feathers like ghosts against the dark ground. Behind the cabin, boot prints led toward the bridge, and there, glinting in the lantern light, lay a piece of copper wire, the kind used by railroad work crews. Caleb arrived just as they were herding the last terrified hen back to safety. He'd been riding the fence line when he saw their light. He examined the wire, his jaw tightening. "They're getting bolder." "Or more desperate," Grace replied, shivering in her thin nightdress and shawl. "The question is why?" Back at the Whitlock Ranch, tensions had reached a breaking point. Samuel confronted his son in the main room, their voices carrying through the log walls. "Saving someone is easy," the old man growled. "Living with the consequences is what separates men from boys. You ready for what comes next? Because Pike and his associates won't stop at scattered chickens." Caleb stood firm, though Grace could see the weight of defiance in his shoulders. "Then what do you suggest? Pa, let them drive out every smallholder until there's nothing left but company land and broken promises." "I suggest you think about this ranch, about the men who depend on us for wages, about the legacy I've spent 40 years building." Samuel's voice dropped, dangerous as thin ice. "I won't see it burned down for a stranger's sake." But Caleb was already reaching for his coat. "Then maybe it's time I started building something of my own." The confrontation left something broken between father and son, a crack that would either heal stronger or shatter completely. Grace watched it happen with a mixture of gratitude and guilt, knowing she was the catalyst, but powerless to stop the reaction. Despite the hardships, small victories emerged. The makeshift school grew to 8 children, their voices rising in unison as they sounded out words. Grace kept a journal, writing by candlelight. February 14th, 5 students can now read water. Young Tom Martinez wrote his name for the first time. These small triumphs feel like rebellion against the darkness pressing in. The land itself seemed to mirror their struggle. Dawn brought frost so thick the prairie sparkled like crushed diamonds, beautiful and sharp enough to cut. The few cattle Grace had managed to trade for grew thin, their breath steaming in the frigid air as they clustered near the cabin for warmth. One evening, as Grace taught Liza to mend harness, Caleb spoke about his childhood. His mother, Clara, had died trying to reach the Olson homestead during a blizzard. She'd known Mrs. Olson was alone with a new baby and fever. Pa found her 2 miles from home, Caleb said quietly. Frozen solid, still facing the direction she'd been heading. He never forgave her for choosing charity over safety, never forgave himself for letting her go. "And you?" Grace asked, her needle pausing. "I learned that in this country, you're defined by what you're willing to risk for others. Pa chose to close himself off after that, built walls high as these mountains. I chose different." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the rough walls. Liza had fallen asleep, her head in Grace's lap, trusting with the complete faith of childhood that the adults would keep the darkness at bay. "Thomas used to say the West would make us or break us," Grace murmured. "I'm beginning to understand what he meant." "It does both," Caleb replied. "Breaks what needs breaking, makes what's strong enough to last." His eyes met hers across the fire. "You're strong enough, Grace. Don't let anyone tell you different." The moment stretched between them, fragile and significant. Then the wind picked up, rattling the patched windows, and they returned to their separate silences, each carrying thoughts too new to voice. 3 days later, Pike returned with 2 companions, rough men with railroad dust on their clothes and calculating eyes. They didn't threaten directly, just stood at the edge of Grace's property, making notes in small books and pointing at the creek. "Surveying for the bridge improvements," Pike called out cheerfully. "Amazing how much traffic this little creek might see once the railroad comes through. Shame if private holdings got in the way of progress." Grace stood in her doorway, rifle in hand. She didn't point it, didn't need to. The message was clear enough. Progress has many definitions. Deputy, Mine includes children who can read and families who can stay on their land." One of the men laughed, ugly and low. "Won't matter much what you define when the territorial court sees our prior claim to water rights. Papers filed last month in the capital, all legal and binding." After they left, Grace's hands shook as she set down the rifle. The game had changed. It wasn't just about intimidation anymore. They were moving through legal channels she couldn't hope to navigate alone. That night, unexpected help arrived. Mrs. Chen appeared at the door with her husband, who ran the town's small newspaper. "We hear things." "Mrs." Chen said simply. "Pike owes money to wrong people. The railroad investors don't know how deep he's in. Maybe someone should tell them." It was the first crack in Pike's armor, and Grace felt a flutter of hope. In this hard country, alliances formed in strange ways. A Chinese laundrywoman, a Mexican farmer's wife, a miner's widow, and a rancher's son. Together, they might just have enough strength to stand against the coming storm. As the Chens left, Caleb arrived with news of his own. Paz agreed to a meeting. Not approval, but he'll listen. Says any woman who can face down Pike with an empty rifle deserves that much. Grace looked at him in surprise. "It wasn't loaded." The men with Pike didn't know that. Sometimes the appearance of strength is all we have. He paused at the door. "But next time, Grace, load it." The moon rose over Mule Creek, casting long shadows across the frozen ground. In her journal that night, Grace wrote, "The tide is turning, though toward what shore I cannot say. We are gathering our small army of the decent and displaced. Tomorrow, we plan. Tonight, I allow myself to hope." The blizzard struck without warning at winter's end, howling down from the north like a living thing bent on destruction. Grace woke to find snow driven through every crack in the cabin walls, her breath forming ice crystals in the air. The roof groaned ominously under the weight of accumulated snow, and then, with a crack like gunfire, a section gave way. Snow and splinters rained down on their makeshift beds. Liza screamed as the wind invaded their shelter, bringing with it a cold so fierce it stole breath and thought alike. Grace grabbed her sister, wrapping them both in every blanket they owned, but she knew with terrible clarity that the cabin wouldn't survive the night. Through the white fury outside came the sound of horses. Caleb appeared like a phantom, ice coating his beard, leading a spare mount. "Can't stay here," he shouted over the wind. "Paz agreed. You're coming to the ranch." The ride back was a nightmare of white blindness and numbing cold. Grace held tight to Caleb's back while Liza clung to her, all of them trusting the horses' instincts to find their way home. When the Whitlock Ranch finally materialized through the storm, it seemed like salvation itself. Samuel Whitlock stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. As Caleb helped the women inside, the old man sighed deeply, the sound carrying the weight of surrender to inevitability. "Get them by the fire," he ordered Rosa, "and make coffee strong enough to wake the dead." That night, as the storm raged against the solid walls of the ranch house, something else burned with equal fury. Grace stood at the window, watching the direction of Mule Creek, and saw an orange glow painting the belly of the storm clouds. Her cabin, their home, was burning. Come morning, the evidence was clear. Horse tracks, 3 sets with fresh shoes, led from the smoldering ruins back toward town. The fire had been set deliberately, timed for the storm when no one could respond. Among the ashes, Caleb found boot prints that matched those from the night the chickens were scattered. Grace stood among the blackened timbers, her face carved from stone, everything they'd built, every small improvement, reduced to memory and ash. Liza clutched the wooden cross, one of the few things they'd carried with them to the ranch, her young face aged by loss. "They mean to break you," Samuel said, having ridden out to survey the damage. His voice held something new, not sympathy exactly, but recognition. "Question is, will you let them—" Grace turned to face him fully. "Mr. Whitlock, I've already been broken. When they brought Thomas up from the mine, when I identified what was left of him, when I signed papers with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, this, she gestured at the ruins, this is just wood and nails. We're still standing. The old man studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. We've got an empty grain storage building, solid walls, good roof. You're welcome to it while we figure out what comes next. It was more than an offer of shelter. It was an acceptance, grudging but real. Caleb caught Grace's eye, and she saw her own surprise reflected there. Sometimes the hardest ground yielded the most unexpected growth. They spent the next days transforming the storage building into living quarters. Grace cooked for the ranch hands, earning her keep with biscuits and stew that made hard men smile. The makeshift school relocated to a corner of the main barn, where children learned their letters surrounded by the warm smell of hay and horses. Liza proved surprisingly resilient, mending torn clothes with tiny, precise stitches and decorating their new space with early wildflowers pressed between book pages. "It's not home," she said quietly one evening. "But maybe home isn't a place. Maybe it's people who don't leave when trouble comes." Harlan Pike arrived with his usual swagger, diminished by the number of armed ranch hands who happened to be cleaning rifles when he rode up. He presented a temporary custody order for the Mule Creek land, claiming safety concerns after the fire. Caleb tore the paper in half without reading it fully. "You want to serve legal papers? Deputy, bring a real judge, not some bought magistrate from the Capitol." Pike's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, Whitlock. Your father built this ranch by knowing when to bend. You're fixing to break instead." "My father built this ranch by standing for what's right," Caleb replied. "I'm just remembering the lesson." That evening, in the privacy of the main house, Samuel confronted his son. "You've drawn a line in the sand. They'll come for us now, not just her." "Then we'd best be ready," Caleb said simply. The old man was quiet for a long moment, then walked to an old trunk in the corner. He pulled out a leather portfolio, yellow with age. "Your mother kept records. Every dirty deal, every bribe Pike's taken over the years. She believed in being prepared." He handed it to Caleb. "Maybe it's time her boy used what she gathered." Grace witnessed this exchange from the doorway, having come to discuss the next day's meals. She saw the pain in Samuel's eyes as he spoke of his wife, saw how much it cost him to open that trunk of memories. "She would have liked you," Samuel said suddenly, addressing Grace. "Clara always said the measure of a person wasn't in their falling, but in their getting up. You've gotten up more than most." That night, Caleb found Grace sitting on the porch steps, looking out at the star-scattered sky. "I'm sorry," she said as he settled beside her, "for bringing this trouble to your door. Your father was right. You could have stayed safe. Safety's an illusion out here," Caleb replied. "Besides, some things are worth the risk." He paused, gathering courage. "My mother used to say that the West strips everything down to essentials. Shows you what really matters. These past weeks, watching you rebuild again and again, teaching those children, facing down men twice your size. I know what matters to me." The words hung between them, weightier than any legal document. Grace felt her heart constrict, caught between grief for what was lost and hope for what might be. "Caleb, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "Just wanted you to know, whatever comes next, you're not facing it alone." Inside the house, a door closed softly. Samuel had been listening, and for the first time in years, he smiled. His boy was finally becoming the man Clara had always believed he could be. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Pete Hawkins, one of Caleb's young ranch hands, had been shot while riding line near Red Gap. The bullet had torn through his shoulder, a warning shot, meant to wound but not kill. Yet, as Grace tended the boy's wounds with steady hands, he gasped out what he'd overheard. "Railroad men, at the old warehouse, talking about the water rights. Said once the widow and her brat were gone, They'd own every drop from here to the Powder. The war for Mule Creek had begun in earnest. But now, Grace wasn't fighting alone. She had the Whitlocks, the Chens, the Martinezes, and others who understood that some battles were about more than land or water. They were about the right to exist on your own terms in a country vast enough for all. That night, as Pete rested fitfully, Grace wrote in her journal, "They burned our house, but not our home. They may own papers, but we own the truth. Tomorrow, we take our case to the territorial marshal. Tonight, I sit watch over a wounded boy and plan for war. Clara Whitlock was right. The West shows you what matters. What matters is standing firm when standing is all you have left." The news of Pete's shooting spread through the valley like wildfire in dry grass. The young cowhand lay fevered in the Whitlock ranch house, his shoulder wrapped in bandages that Grace changed twice daily. The bullet had been meant as a warning, but warnings in this hard country had a way of becoming prophecies. "Railroad men," Pete whispered through cracked lips, his eyes bright with pain and anger. "Heard them talking at the old warehouse near the tracks. They got maps, papers. Said once the widow and her brat were gone, they'd control every drop of water from here to the Powder River." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Grace kept her hands steady as she worked. But inside, something cold and determined was taking shape. They'd moved beyond intimidation now. Blood had been spilled, and everyone knew there was no going back. In town, the divide had become a chasm. At Morrison's general store, conversations died when Grace entered. Some folks, like Mrs. Patterson, turned their backs entirely, but others, the Chens, the Martinezes, old Jim Brennan, who ran the livery, nodded their support. The town was choosing sides, and the lines weren't drawn where anyone might have expected. The saloon buzzed with poisonous talk. Ever since that widow showed up, nothing but trouble. Someone muttered into their whiskey. "First the Whitlock boy goes soft, then fires, now shooting. Woman's cursed, plain and simple." Caleb stood at the bar, his presence alone enough to quiet most voices, but not all. A ranch hand from a neighboring spread, deep in his cups, kept going. Maybe someone should remind her that widows who don't know their place sometimes become statistics. The room went still. Caleb set down his glass with deliberate care. "Pete Hawkins is 19 years old, he said, his voice carrying to every corner. "Shot for riding fence on land we've worked for 20 years. Anyone wants to talk about curses and statistics. They can address their concerns to me directly." "Or to me," Samuel Whitlock added from the doorway. The old man's appearance shocked everyone. He rarely came to town anymore, and never to the saloon. "Seems folks have forgotten what this valley was built on, not by railroad money or Eastern speculators, but by people who stood together against whatever came. My wife knew that. This widow knows that. Question is, do you?" The silence stretched taut as fence wire. Then Jim Brennan raised his glass. "To standing together," he said simply, "one by one." Others followed suit, not everyone, but enough. The tide was turning. That night at the ranch, Grace found herself alone with Samuel in his study. The walls were lined with ledgers dating back decades, the history of the Whitlock Ranch written in columns of numbers and careful notes. "My Clara was like you," Samuel said suddenly, not looking up from the papers spread before him. "Stubborn, righteous, thought she could save everyone." His voice roughened. "I spent 20 years angry at her for dying. Wasted time I can't get back." Grace waited, understanding that this confession was rare as rain in drought season. "Don't let my boy waste his years on could-have-beens," Samuel continued. "Whatever's growing between you two, don't let fear or propriety kill it. This land's taken enough. Don't give it more than necessary." Before Grace could respond, Caleb burst through the door. "Riders coming! 8, maybe 10! Armed!" They moved quickly, efficiently. Samuel handed out rifles from the gun cabinet while Grace helped Pete to a defensive position despite his protests. Liza, pale but determined, loaded ammunition with hands that barely trembled. The riders stopped just outside rifle range. Harlan Pike sat his horse at the front, badge glinting in the moonlight. "Samuel Whitlock," he called. "I'm here serving legal papers. You're harboring fugitives from justice." "What charges?" Samuel called back. "Theft of railroad property, interference with lawful commerce, and suspected arson." Pike's smile was visible even at distance. "The widow burned her own place for insurance money. Everyone knows it." It was a lie so blatant it took breath away. There had been no insurance. What mining widow could afford such luxury? But truth mattered less than legal documents in territorial courts. "You want them. You come get them," Caleb shouted. "But you better bring more than bought papers and railroad thugs." The standoff stretched through the night. Neither side wanted to fire first, Pike because he needed the veneer of legality. The Whitlocks because they knew that defending their home was different from starting a war. As dawn painted the sky pink and gold, unexpected help arrived. A dust cloud from the south resolved into a column of riders. The Martinezes, the Brennans, even stern Reverend Walsh from the Methodist Church. They arranged themselves alongside the Whitlock hands, a clear message written in gunmetal and determination. Pike's men shifted nervously. They'd expected an easy arrest, not a community in arms. The deputy's face darkened as he realized his miscalculation.
"This isn't over,"
he snarled, wheeling his horse around.
"The law's on our side."
"Then bring a real lawman," Samuel called after him.
"Not a bought dog wearing a stolen badge."
As the riders retreated, Grace felt her knees weaken. The confrontation had been won, but the war was far from over. She found Caleb checking on Pete, his hands gentle despite their strength. "Thank you," she said simply. He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw not just duty or neighborly concern, but something deeper and more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. "I meant what I said before. You're not alone in this." That evening, as the ranch settled into uneasy peace, Grace made a decision. She found Caleb in the barn, mending tack by lantern light. The familiar sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and hay rustling provided a backdrop to what needed saying. "I've been thinking about fear," she began. "How it makes us small, how it steals futures we haven't even imagined yet." She took a breath, tasting courage. "I don't want to be small anymore, Caleb, and I don't want fear to steal whatever this is between us." He set down the leather, stood slowly. "Grace, I'm not asking for promises," she interrupted. "I know what we're facing, but if we're going to fight for water rights and justice and the right to exist on our own terms, shouldn't we also fight for the possibility of happiness?" In answer, he crossed the space between them, cupped her face in his work-roughened hands. "I've been fighting for that since the day you stood in my kitchen, half frozen but unbroken. Question is, are you sure this isn't going to get easier?" "When has anything in my life been easy?" she asked, and surprised them both by laughing. "At least now I'm not facing the hard parts alone." He kissed her then, careful and tender, and for a moment the threats and violence faded away. There was only this, two people choosing each other despite the odds. Because of them, it was its own form of rebellion, perhaps the most powerful one. From the house came the sound of Liza playing the old piano, a hymn their mother had taught them years ago. The notes carried on the night air, speaking of hope and home and the promise that joy could exist even in the valley of shadows. "Whatever comes next," Caleb murmured against her hair, "we face it together." Grace nodded, feeling something settle into place inside her chest. Not healing, that would take years yet, but the beginning of wholeness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Pike would return with reinforcements, and the fight for Mule Creek would escalate. But tonight, in a barn that smelled of hay and leather and possibility, two people had chosen to build rather than simply survive. In this harsh land that took so much, they'd found something worth protecting. And that, Grace thought as Caleb's arms tightened around her, was its own kind of victory. The town meeting convened in Morrison's grain warehouse on a Thursday evening, the air thick with tobacco smoke and tension. Ranchers, shopkeepers, and homesteaders filled the space, their faces revealing the deep divisions that had split Dry Willow down the middle. Reverend Walsh opened with a reading from Scripture. "Blessed are they who hunger and thirst after righteousness," his voice carrying over the restless crowd. Grace stood when called, her gray dress pressed and neat, her bearing straight despite the weight of hostile stares. "I'm not asking for pity," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I'm asking for water rights and conscience. Our children need clean water and education. Every family here knows that truth, whether they admit it or not." Mrs. Harrison, wife of the largest merchant in town, pursed her lips disapprovingly, but others, more than Grace had dared hope, nodded slowly. The seeds of change, planted in small acts of kindness and teaching, were beginning to sprout even in hard ground. Caleb rose next, unfolding Thomas's old water map with careful hands. The penciled lines showed the original creek bed, the underground springs, the natural flow before improvements had begun diverting water toward railroad interests. "I'm proposing we form a water collective," he said. "Share the resource fairly, based on acreage and need, not on who has the deepest pockets or the most guns." The idea was radical. Cooperation instead of competition in a land where every drop could mean survival. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some approving, others skeptical. Harlan Pike laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the discussion. He threw a stack of papers on the table with theatrical flair. "Legal authorization from the territorial capital. The railroad has prior claim to all water rights along the proposed route. Your little collective is about as legal as claim jumping." But as he spoke, something unexpected happened. The copper wire that Grace had found after her chickens were scattered, the evidence Caleb had kept, slipped from Pike's coat pocket as he gestured. It fell to the floor with a soft clink, and in the sudden silence, everyone understood its significance. "Interesting thing to carry, Deputy," Jim Brennan observed mildly. "Same type of wire used in railroad construction. Same type found at every scene of harassment against the widow Moran." Pike's face flushed dark red. "That don't prove nothing?" "Proves enough," Samuel Whitlock interrupted, stepping forward. The crowd parted before him like water before a stone. "I've lived in this valley 43 years, seen it go from wilderness to civilization. But civilization isn't about papers and legal tricks. It's about people choosing to live by something higher than greed." The old man's words carried weight that no amount of railroad money could buy. One by one, others began to speak. Small ranchers who'd been pressured to sell. Merchants tired of outside interests controlling local commerce. Mothers worried about their children's future. The meeting ended without violence, but with something more dangerous to Pike's plan's unity. As people filed out, many stopped to nod at Grace or shake Caleb's hand. The tide hadn't just turned, it had become a flood. That night, retaliation came swift and vicious. 4 men cornered Caleb in the alley behind the feed store. Grace, returning from the Chens with medical supplies for Pete, heard the scuffle and didn't hesitate. She grabbed a lamp from a nearby post and threw it hard, oil spattering across the alley. The sudden flare of light revealed the attackers' faces. Railroad muscle. Not locals. "Next one lands on you," she called out, already reaching for another lamp. "Wonder how your bosses would feel about their hired men burned in a back alley brawl." The men retreated, dragging one who'd taken Caleb's fist to the jaw. Caleb leaned against the wall, blood seeping from a cut above his eye. "Getting good at the rescue business," he said, attempting a smile. "Partnership," Grace corrected, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind his wound. "That's what you called it, isn't it?" Back at the ranch, they found Samuel deep in correspondence with his lawyer in Cheyenne. "Telegraph came while you were gone," he said. "Our territorial representative is interested in the railroad's land dealings. Seems they're not the only ones who've complained about strong-arm tactics. It was the first real hope for legal recourse, but Grace knew better than to trust in distant justice. The law moved slowly, when it moved at all, and Pike wouldn't wait for official judgments. In the kitchen, Liza helped Rosa prepare poultices for Caleb's bruises. The girl had grown in these hard months, her childhood compressed by necessity but not broken by it. "Are we winning?" she asked quietly. Grace considered the question. "We're surviving. Sometimes that's the same thing." "Pa would be proud," Liza said, and for the first time since Thomas's death, speaking of him brought more warmth than pain. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Margaret Chen, normally so reserved, arrived breathless with news. "My husband's newspaper contacts in the capital. They say the railroad investors don't know what Pike's been doing here, the violence, the threats. They think he's negotiating peacefully." It was an opening, slim but real. If they could get word to the actual investors, show them how their representative was poisoning potential profits with his tactics. "I'll ride to Cheyenne," Caleb decided. "Take the evidence directly to them." "Not alone," Grace said firmly. When he started to protest, she cut him off. "Partnership. Remember, besides, they might listen to a widow's testimony about burned homes and scattered livestock. Makes it harder to dismiss as rivalry between men." Samuel surprised them both by agreeing, "Take Pete's testimony too. Written and witnessed. Boy's got no stake in this except the bullet hole in his shoulder. That speaks louder than any accusation." They prepared to leave at dawn, but that night, one more piece fell into place. A knock at the door revealed Marcus Chen, the newspaper editor, accompanied by a thin man in a dusty suit. "Federal Marshal," the man introduced himself. "James McKenna. Been investigating railroad corruption throughout the territory. Heard there might be a story here worth telling." It was more than they dared hope for, not just local law, but federal authority. McKenna listened to their story with sharp eyes that missed nothing, occasionally jotting notes in a small book. "Pike's not the first to use a badge for private gain," he said finally. "Won't be the last, but with enough evidence, we can make him an example others might think twice about following." Grace felt something ease in her chest. Not relief, they were far from safe, but the sense that justice might actually be possible, that the strong didn't always prey on the weak without consequence. Late that night, she found Caleb on the porch, studying the stars. "Scared?" she asked, settling beside him. "Terrified," he admitted. "Not of Pike or his men. Of failing you, of not being strong enough to see this through." She took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars of a life lived honestly. "You told me once that courage was being scared and standing firm anyway. Seems to me you've been doing that all along." "We both have," he said, turning to face her. "Grace, when this is over—" "When this is over," she interrupted gently, "we'll have time for all the words we're storing up. For now, it's enough to know they're there, waiting." He nodded, understanding. In times of crisis, hope had to be hoarded like water in drought, parceled out carefully lest it evaporate entirely. But it was there between them, growing stronger with each shared struggle. Inside the house, Liza played the piano again, not a hymn this time, but a lively dance tune their mother had loved. The notes spilled out into the night, defiant and joyful, a reminder that life persisted even in the shadow of threat. Tomorrow would bring the ride to Cheyenne, the gamble of speaking truth to power. But tonight, on a porch overlooking land that had seen so much struggle, two people sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, facing whatever came with the unified strength that was reshaping their corner of the West. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, but below them, human choices were writing a different story, one where might didn't always make right, where community could triumph over corruption, and where love could grow even in the harshest ground. The fire started in early summer, when the grass stood tall and dry as tinder. Someone had dropped a cigarette, or so the railroad men claimed, near the southern boundary of Whitlock land. But the wind that day blew from the south, pushing flames north toward the ranch with suspicious precision. The sky turned orange-red, and ash fell like hellish snow across the valley. Caleb divided the hands quickly, his voice carrying over the roar of approaching flames. "Martinez, take your boys and drive the cattle toward Rocky Point. Jim, we need a fire break along the eastern ridge. Wet down everything you can." He turned to Grace, who had arrived with water barrels from town. "Get the children to the root cellar. This is going to get worse before it gets better." Samuel Whitlock, forgetting his age and infirmity, threw aside his walking stick and mounted his old gelding.
"Haven't fought a grass fire in 20 years,
he growled.
but by God, I haven't forgotten how—"
He rode straight toward the wall of flame, cursing it like a personal enemy. The battle lasted through the night. Men beat at flames with wet blankets, dug desperate fire breaks with shovels and bare hands, drove panicked cattle through smoke thick as wool. Grace organized the women and children, soaking feed sacks for the firefighters, tending burns with steady hands despite the chaos around her. By midnight, they'd saved the main herd and the house, but 3 hay barns were gone, reduced to glowing skeletons against the night sky. The firefighters collapsed where they stood, faces black with soot, clothes singed and smoking. The cost of victory was written in exhaustion and loss. As dawn broke over the devastated landscape, Grace moved among the men with water and clean rags. She found Samuel slumped against a fence post, his hands blistered and raw. The old man looked up at her with eyes that had aged a decade in one night. "Haven't worked that hard since Clara was alive," he said hoarsely. "She always said the land tests us, makes us prove we deserve it." He accepted the water gratefully, then caught her hand. "You've proven it, girl. Whatever else happens, you've earned your place here." The morning light revealed the full extent of the damage and the evidence. Caleb found the trail where the fire had started cigarette butts. Yes, but arranged in a deliberate line along the driest grass. Nearby, wagon tracks led back toward the railroad camp. It hadn't been carelessness but arson, timed for maximum destruction. In town, the story spread quickly. By noon, a crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office. Not Pike's domain, but the small federal office Marshal McKenna had established. The Chen family arrived with a petition signed by 43 households. The Martinezes brought witness statements, even Mrs. Harrison, who had been so dismissive at the town meeting, stood with them. Her son's asthma worsened by the smoke that still hung heavy in the air. "Enough," she declared to anyone who would listen. "When they burn out decent folks for profit, when our children can't breathe for their greed, enough." Pike appeared with his usual swagger diminished, flanked by 2 nervous-looking railroad representatives. The senior man, a Mr. Garrett from Chicago, looked deeply uncomfortable as the crowd's anger focused on him. "The Western Rail Company doesn't condone violence," Garrett insisted. "If our local representatives have exceeded their authority—" "Exceeded?" Grace stepped forward, soot still streaking her face, her voice carrying the exhaustion and fury of the night's battle. "They burned 3,000 acres. They shot a 19-year-old boy. They scattered my livestock and burned my home. What would you call it, Mr. Garrett, if not exceeding authority?" Caleb stood beside her, presenting the evidence they'd gathered. The copper wire, the boot prints, Pete's testimony. Now the deliberately set cigarette butts. Your company hired Pike to secure water rights. These are his methods. Question is, do you stand by them? The crowd pressed closer, their silence more threatening than any shouted abuse. Garrett loosened his collar, sweating despite the morning cool. He was a businessman, not a frontier tough, and he could calculate odds as well as anyone. The equation here was clear. Continued violence would cost more than negotiation. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should discuss alternative arrangements." It was the crack in the dam they'd been fighting for. McKenna stepped in smoothly, suggesting all parties adjourn to his office for formal negotiations. But as they turned to go, Pike made his last desperate play.
"You're all fools,"
he snarled, hand moving toward his gun. "You think the railroad cares about your little petition? They'll buy judges, import new muscle, starve you out one by one." He never finished the threat. Samuel Whitlock's rifle was in his hands before Pike could clear leather, the old man's reflexes still quick despite his years. "Draw that iron and I'll drop you where you stand," Samuel said quietly. "Badge or no badge, a man's got the right to defend his land." Pike froze, calculating. Around him, other guns had appeared in the hands of ranchers, farmers, even mild-mannered shopkeepers. The uprising he'd dismissed as temporary had become something more dangerous, a community united. McKenna arrested Pike on charges of conspiracy and corruption, leading him away in irons while the deputy cursed and threatened, but his words rang hollow now, the spell of fear broken by collective courage. The negotiations that followed were tense but productive. Garrett, eager to salvage something from the disaster, agreed to recognize existing water rights and compensate those who'd suffered losses. The railroad would get its access, but through legal purchase and fair dealing, not intimidation. That evening, as the sun set over the scorched prairie, Grace stood with Caleb surveying the damage. The land would heal already. She could see green shoots pushing through the ash. Fire, for all its destruction, also cleared the way for new growth. "We won," Liza said, joining them. She'd worked through the night alongside the adults, earning her place in the community's respect. "Didn't we?" "We survived," Caleb corrected gently. "Won't know if we've won until we see what grows from here." Grace thought about that as they walked back toward the ranch house. Victory in this land was never absolute, never final. It was measured in small gains, in communities that chose courage over fear, in love that bloomed despite hardship. Samuel met them at the door, a rare smile creasing his weathered face. "Rosa's got supper waiting. And Caleb," he paused, seeming to wrestle with words, "your mother would be proud. You stood for what was right, even when standing was costly. That's all any man can do." Inside, the kitchen was warm with lamplight and filled with the voices of the neighbors who'd stayed to help. The Chens were there, and the Martinezes, Jim Brennan and his sons, even prim Mrs. Harrison. They'd faced the fire together and emerged not unscathed but unbroken. As Grace helped serve the meal, she caught Caleb watching her with an expression that made her heart turn over. They'd been through trial by fire, literally and figuratively. What grew from here would be their choice. Pete Hawkins, his arm still in a sling but his color good, raised a glass of Rosa's lemonade. "To standing together," he said, echoing Jim Brennan's toast from the saloon. This time, everyone drank deep. Later, as the evening wound down, Caleb drew Grace aside. They stood on the porch, looking out at the stars beginning to pierce the smoke-hazed sky. "McKenna says the federal prosecutor will likely offer Pike a deal to testify against the railroad's corruption in other territories," he said. "This could help folks all along the frontier." "Thomas would have liked that," Grace said softly. "Knowing his death led to something larger than just our survival." "You led to something larger," Caleb said. "You and your refusal to be driven off. You gave the rest of us something to rally around." She shook her head. "We all chose to stand. That's what makes a community, not one person's courage, but everyone's willingness to share the risk." In the distance, a coyote called, its voice wild and free. The land would always be harsh, demanding more than it gave. But tonight, with their enemies scattered and their friends close, the price seemed bearable. "What comes next?" Grace asked. Caleb took her hand, his touch warm and sure. "We rebuild the barns, replant the burned pasture, file the water rights properly with the federal office." He paused. "And maybe we stop pretending there isn't something more between us than partnership." Before Grace could respond, Liza appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Chen wants to know if we're still having school tomorrow." Grace laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. "Yes, especially tomorrow. We have a victory to celebrate and lessons to learn from it." As they went inside together, Grace felt the truth of her words. Every ending was also a beginning. Every loss a chance for something new. The fire had taken much but clarified more. Who stood with them? What mattered most? And where their future lay. The West would continue to test them, but they'd proven they could meet its challenges. Not alone, but together. A truth more valuable than all the water rights in the territory. Dawn broke gray and ominous over the Whitlock Ranch, the air heavy with the promise of violence. Harlan Pike had returned with reinforcements, 20 men positioned on the rocky outcrop overlooking the main gate, their rifles glinting like teeth in the early light. They'd come during the night, moving with the practiced stealth of men who'd done this kind of work before. Caleb woke to the sound of horses whinnying nervously. Through the window, he could see the silhouettes against the skyline, could count the rifles trained on his home. He dressed quickly, grimly, knowing this was the confrontation they'd all been dreading. "They're here," he told his father, finding Samuel already awake and loading ammunition. The old man nodded, his face carved from stone. "Figured Pike wouldn't go quiet. Man like that needs to burn everything down rather than admit defeat." He paused in his loading, a tremor running through his hands. "Get everyone to defensive positions. This is our ground. We know it better than they do." Caleb organized their defenses with the efficiency learned from years of managing cattle drives and fighting off rustlers. The stone wall of the horse paddock became cover for the ranch hands. The barn's hayloft provided high ground for their best marksmen, but they were outnumbered 2-1, and everyone knew it. Grace pulled Liza and the other children into the root cellar, her movements calm despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Stay quiet," she instructed them. "Mrs. Chen will read to you, and before you know it, this will all be over." Young Tom Martinez clutched his slate board like a shield. "Will they hurt us? Mrs. Grace." She knelt before him, her voice steady as bedrock. "No, Tom, good people won't let that happen. Now, practice your letters like we talked about. Show me how well you can write courage." Above ground, the siege began with Pike's voice carrying across the morning air. "Samuel Whitlock, you're harboring fugitives and interfering with legal railroad business. Send out the widow and we'll consider this matter closed." Samuel's response was a rifle shot that kicked up dust inches from Pike's boots. "Only thing closing here is your future. Pike, you want them. You come through me." The morning erupted in gunfire. Bullets whined off rocks and thudded into wooden walls. The attackers had superior numbers but inferior position. The Whitlock Ranch had been built to withstand Indian raids in the early days, and its defensive advantages showed. During a lull in the shooting, Caleb made his way to the main house. Keeping low, he found Grace loading rifles with practiced efficiency, her face smudged with powder smoke. "You should be in the cellar," he said. "And you should have more loaded weapons," she countered, handing him a fresh rifle. "Partnership, remember?" Through the window, they could see Samuel directing fire from behind an overturned wagon. The old man had taken a grazing shot to the arm but refused to stop fighting, his voice roaring defiance at their attackers. By noon, the attackers had managed to set fire to the hay barn, the same one they'd just rebuilt after the grass fire. Smoke poured across the compound, providing cover for Pike's men to advance closer. The acrid smell brought back memories of all they'd already lost, all they stood to lose still. "They're trying to smoke us out," Caleb said, calculating distances and wind direction. "If that fire spreads to the main barn." "The horses," Grace finished. Without hesitation, she started for the door. "We have to get them out." They ran together through the smoke and chaos, bullets singing past their heads. In the barn, horses screamed and kicked at their stalls, maddened by the smell of fire. Grace went straight to the stallion everyone said was too wild to handle, speaking in low, calm tones as she slipped a rope around his neck. "That's it," she crooned, leading him toward the door. "Just follow me. We're getting out of here." Caleb watched her with a mixture of terror and awe as she led the stallion out, the other horses following their leader into the relative safety of the far pasture. They'd just gotten the last mare clear when the barn roof began to smolder. Back at the house, the situation was deteriorating. 2 ranch hands were wounded, ammunition was running low, and Pike's men had found better positions. It was then that Liza performed her own act of courage. The girl had slipped from the cellar despite strict orders, making her way to the highest point of the house, the widow's walk that Clara Whitlock had insisted on building years ago. Using a hand mirror, she began flashing signals toward town, the code that every frontier child learned 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, SOS. Marshal McKenna saw the signals from his position at the edge of town, where he'd been gathering men since word of the attack reached him. "That's our cue, boys," he said, spurring his horse forward. Behind him rode not just federal deputies, but townspeople, the Chens, the Martinezes, Jim Brennan and his sons, even Reverend Walsh with a rifle across his saddle. The arrival of reinforcements changed everything. Pike's men, already bloodied from the morning's fighting, saw the dust cloud of approaching riders and began to waver. They'd signed on for easy intimidation, not a full-scale battle against an aroused community. "Stand your ground," Pike screamed, but his voice cracked with desperation. He could see his carefully laid plans crumbling, his future as a railroad enforcer evaporating like morning dew. The federal marshal's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "This is federal authority. Throw down your weapons or face charges of insurrection." Some of Pike's men complied immediately. Others tried to run, only to find their escape routes cut off by townspeople who'd circled behind them. The siege collapsed into a rout, hired guns throwing down rifles and raising hands in surrender. Pike himself made one last desperate play. Seeing Grace exposed as she helped a wounded ranch hand, he raised his pistol. Time seemed to slow as Caleb saw the threat, too far away to intervene. It was Samuel who acted. The old man stepped directly into Pike's line of fire, his own rifle steady despite his wounded arm. "You want to shoot someone? Pike, shoot me. I'm the one who stood against you from the start." For a moment, the 2 men faced each other, the old rancher who'd built his life on honor and hard work, and the corrupt lawman who'd sold his badge for railroad gold. Then Pike made his choice, swinging his gun towards Samuel. The shot that rang out wasn't Pike's. Marshal McKenna's rifle spoke first, and Pike crumpled, his weapon falling unfired from nerveless fingers. He wasn't dead, but the shoulder wound would end his gunfighting days forever. In the sudden silence that followed, Grace found herself at Caleb's side. He was gripping her hand so tight it hurt, both of them staring at Samuel, who still stood firm despite the blood seeping through his shirt. "Did you mean it?" Grace asked quietly, though her voice carried in the stillness. "This land, this heart, both are yours." Caleb turned to her, and in his eyes she saw everything, the fear of loss, the joy of survival, the promise of tomorrow. "Every word," he said, "then and now and always." Around them, Pike's men were being rounded up and disarmed. The wounded were being tended. The immediate danger had passed, but everyone knew this moment was somehow larger than just another frontier skirmish. "Well then," Grace said, her voice stronger now, carrying to the assembled crowd, "I suppose we'd better make it official. A widow can't run a ranch alone, and a rancher's son can't stand against the world without partners." She paused, looking at the faces around them, Anglo and Mexican and Chinese, established families and newcomers, all united by the morning's shared danger. All of us together, that's what makes a community. That's what makes a home. Samuel limped over, Rosa fussing at his wounds. The old man looked at Grace, then at his son. and finally at the crowd of neighbors who'd risked everything to stand with them.
"You'll need a proper house," he said gruffly. "Can't raise a family in a converted grain shed."
He turned to the assembled crowd. "And we'll need a school. A real one. Not just benches in a barn. Teachers gotta have a proper place to work." It was surrender and victory rolled into one. Samuel's acceptance of the future that had been struggling to be born throughout this violent year. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but didn't try to hide them. In this land that demanded strength, sometimes the strongest thing was to show your heart. As the sun reached its zenith, Marshal McKenna finished securing his prisoners. Pike would live to stand trial, and his testimony would help break the railroad's stranglehold on other communities across the territory. The water rights would be secured, the collective established, and the rule of law restored. But those were tomorrow's victories. Today's was simpler and more profound, a community that had chosen to stand together, a love that had grown despite every obstacle, and the promise that the West could be more than just survival. "This land, this heart, both are yours," Grace repeated softly, for Caleb's ears alone. "And mine are yours, if you'll have them." His answer was in his kiss, there in the smoke and ruin of their battlefield, surrounded by friends and beneath the endless sky. It was a promise and a beginning, a seal on all they'd fought for and all they'd built together. The West had tested them with everything it had, drought and fire, violence and loss. They'd answered with courage, community, and love. And in this harsh land that gave nothing easily, that was the greatest victory of all. The trial convened outdoors under a sprawling cottonwood, the territorial judge having declared that justice should be visible to all who had suffered under Pike's reign. The September wind carried the smell of sage and possibility as witnesses took their places on rough benches hauled from the church. Grace sat with Thomas's water map spread before her, the penciled lines now evidence in a larger fight for justice. Judge Harrison, a stern man with 30 years of frontier law behind him, listened as the story unfolded. Each witness added another piece, the Chen family speaking of threats and midnight harassment, the Martinezes describing cattle found shot near water sources, Jim Brennan detailing the suspicious fires that always seemed to benefit railroad interests. When Grace took her turn, she spoke simply and clearly about the night her chickens were scattered, about watching her home burn during the blizzard, about the morning they'd stood against 20 armed men for the right to exist on their own land. The judge's eyes never left her face as she held up the copper wire, the same type found at every scene of violence. This was never about progress or railroad expansion. She concluded, this was about greed wearing a badge, using fear as a weapon against people whose only crime was wanting to build something lasting. The crowd murmured agreement, their face telling their own stories of intimidation and loss. These were people who'd carved homes from wilderness, who understood that the law meant nothing if it could be bought and sold like cattle. Harlan Pike sat shackled between two federal marshals, his wounded shoulder making him list to one side. When called to testify, he tried bluster first, then denial. But Marshal McKenna's evidence was overwhelming. Documents seized from Pike's office revealed payments from Avery Pike and Associates, orders to secure water access by any means necessary, and correspondence promising bonuses for every homesteader driven off.
"You were sworn to protect these people,"
Judge Harrison said, his voice heavy with disgust. "Instead, you sold your oath for railroad gold." Pike's facade finally cracked. Facing 20 years in federal prison, he began to talk names, dates, amounts, the whole corrupt network that stretched from Cheyenne to Chicago. His words painted a picture of systematic theft dressed up as progress, of Eastern money buying Western violence. The railroad representatives, including Mr. Garrett, sat pale and sweating as their company's crimes were laid bare. They'd claimed ignorance, but Pike's testimony revealed knowledge at the highest levels. Board members who spoke of clearing the path and removing obstacles while maintaining clean hands back east. The Western Rail Company, Judge Harrison pronounced. We'll pay full restitution to every family harmed by these criminal acts. Furthermore, all water rights obtained through intimidation are hereby voided. The land and its resources belong to those who work it, not those who would steal it. The judgment was more than anyone had dared hope for. As the judge's gavel fell, a cheer went up from the assembled crowd. Justice, so rare in the territories, had actually prevailed. That evening, the community gathered at the Whitlock Ranch for what began as a celebration but became something more, a healing. Tables groaned under the weight of shared food. Children ran between the adults' legs, and for the first time in months, laughter came easily. Samuel Whitlock, his arm still bandaged from the siege, stood with effort to address the crowd. I've lived on this land longer than most, he began, his voice carrying across the yard. Thought I knew what strength looked like, in cattle, in weather, in men, but this past year taught me different. He looked at Grace, then at his son. Strength isn't standing alone against the storm. It's having the wisdom to stand together. My Clara knew that. Took me too long to remember it. But I'm remembering now. The old man walked to where Grace stood with Caleb, each step deliberate despite his wounds. From his pocket, he drew out a small leather pouch and pressed it into Grace's hands. Inside was Clara's wedding ring, worn thin by years of work, but still gleaming. She would have wanted you to have this. Samuel said gruffly, would have said a teacher needs proper recognition, especially one who's taught us all so much about courage. Grace's eyes filled as she understood the gesture, not just acceptance, but blessing. Not just for her, but for the future she and Caleb would build together. I'll honor it, she promised, and her memory. As night fell, couples danced to fiddle music under stars that seemed especially bright. Children who'd learned their letters in barns and root cellars recited them proudly for anyone who'd listen. The Mule Creek School, they announced, would have real walls and windows, books from Denver, and a bell to ring each morning. Caleb found Grace by the new well they'd dug near the burned cabin site. The water ran clear and cold, fed by the spring Thomas had mapped before his death. She was gazing at the stars reflected in the water, looking thoughtful. Regrets? He asked softly. She shook her head. Gratitude. Thomas saw something in this land worth fighting for. He'd be glad to know we honored that vision. She turned to face him. We've won the right to build here. Question is, what do we build? Whatever we want, Caleb said, taking her hands. A home, a school, a place where Liza can grow up strong and unafraid, where children of all backgrounds can learn side by side, where water flows to those who need it, not just those who can pay. That's a lot of building, Grace observed, but she was smiling. Good thing we've got help, Caleb replied, gesturing toward the celebration. Turns out, when you stand for others, they stand for you. Ma tried to teach me that. Took you to make me understand it. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their community celebrate not just victory but survival, not just justice but hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, fences to mend, schools to build, a ranch to run. But tonight was for recognizing how far they'd come. When? Grace asked simply. Soon as you're ready. Caleb answered, understanding. Though if you want my opinion, we've waited long enough. Pike's gone. The water rights are secure. And I can't think of a single reason to delay except propriety. And when has that ever stopped us? Grace laughed, the sound bright as the stars above. Next month, then, give folks time to recover from all this excitement before we give them more. Next month, Caleb agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted of new beginnings. Back at the celebration, Liza was teaching the younger children a song about water and growing things. Her voice, clear and strong, carried across the ranch. From tiny springs come mighty rivers. From single seeds grow tallest trees. From acts of courage, hope delivers. Communities from bended knees. It wasn't a song anyone had taught her. She'd made it up herself. This girl who'd lost a father but gained a community, who'd seen the worst of human greed but also the best of human courage. In her young voice was the future they were all building together. As the evening wound down, families began departing with promises to help rebuild, to contribute to the school, to stand ready if ever needed again. The Chinese families, the Mexican families, the established Anglo families, all united now by shared struggle and mutual respect. Marshal McKenna was among the last to leave. "You've done something important here," he told Grace and Caleb. "Not just standing up to corruption, but showing others it can be done. Word's spreading to other territories. Communities are organizing, demanding better. You've lit a fire, and it's the kind that builds instead of destroys." After everyone had gone, Grace stood with Caleb and Samuel on the porch, looking out over their land. The burned areas were already showing green shoots. The new well pumped steadily. In the distance, cattle lowed contentedly, and somewhere an owl called into the darkness. "This land, this heart, both are yours," Caleb murmured, repeating the promise that had sustained them through siege and trial. "And mine are yours," Grace replied, completing what had become their private vow, "along with whatever we build together." Samuel cleared his throat. "Well then, we'd better get building. Winter's coming, and that school won't raise itself. Besides," he added with a rare smile, "I'm thinking we'll need a bigger house soon enough. Can't have my grandchildren sleeping in a grain shed." Grace blushed while Caleb grinned, but neither denied the possibility. In this land of harsh realities and harder choices, they'd learn to grab hope with both hands and hold tight. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles, but below them, 3 people stood together, planning a future that would honor the past while reaching towards something better. It was the way of the West, taking what was broken and building something stronger, taking what was divided and creating unity, taking what seemed impossible and making it real through sheer determination and community spirit. Tomorrow would begin the actual work of construction, but tonight they savored the victory of survival, the promise of justice, and the certainty that whatever challenges came next, they would face them together. Autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and rust, the buffalo grass rippling like a vast inland sea under the endless sky. The morning of the wedding dawned crystal clear, with the kind of light that made the mountains seem close enough to touch. Grace stood before the mirror in Clara Whitlock's room, wearing the older woman's wedding dress, carefully altered by Rosa and Mrs. Chen, each stitch a blessing from the community that had become family. Liza fastened tiny wildflowers into her sister's hair, her hands steady and sure. The girl had grown inches since spring, her face losing its childish roundness but keeping its determined spirit. "Ma would be happy," she said softly. "And Pa, too. They'd say you chose well." "We chose each other," Grace corrected gently. "And we chose this place, these people. That's what they'd be happy about." Outside, the ranch had been transformed. Willow branches formed an archway facing Mule Creek, the water running clear and strong after the autumn rains. Benches from the new schoolhouse, proper ones, carved by Jim Brennan and his sons, stood in neat rows. The entire valley seemed to have gathered, bringing food, flowers, and the gift of their presence. Samuel Whitlock waited by the door, dressed in his finest coat, standing straighter than he had in years. When Grace appeared, he offered his arm with gruff courtesy. "Ready to join this family proper?" he asked. "I've been part of this family since the night you let us sleep by your fire," Grace replied. "This just makes it official." The old man's eyes misted, though he'd deny it later. "Clara always said the land knows its own. You belonged here from the start. We just took a while to see it." They walked together toward the creek, where Caleb waited with Reverend Walsh. He wore a new black suit, but what transformed him was the expression on his face as Grace approached. Joy mixed with wonder. as if he couldn't quite believe this moment had arrived after all they'd endured. The ceremony itself was simple, the words as plain and true as the land around them. But when Reverend Walsh asked for the rings, it was Pete Hawkins who stepped forward, his shoulder healed but scarred, carrying the band that had been Clara's on a small wooden plate he'd carved himself. "For the woman who saved my life," he said simply, and there wasn't a dry eye in the gathering. When Caleb spoke his vows, his voice carried across the water. "Grace, you came to this valley broken by loss, and instead of letting it defeat you, you taught us all how to rebuild. You showed us that strength isn't about standing alone, but standing together. This land, this heart, both are yours, today, tomorrow, and all the days after." Grace's response was equally direct. "Caleb, you offered shelter to strangers and never stopped offering it, even when it cost you dearly. You showed me that love isn't just about holding on, but about having the courage to reach out. My heart, my hand, my future, they're yours, as surely as this creek flows to the river." As they kissed to seal their union, a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing and wild. The gathering erupted in cheers that echoed off the distant mountains, a sound of triumph that belonged to all of them. The celebration that followed was a testament to the community they'd built. Mexican guitarists played alongside Irish fiddlers. Children of all backgrounds ran together, playing games that needed no common language beyond laughter. Tables groaned under dishes that told the story of the frontier German sauerkraut next to Chinese dumplings, Mexican tamales beside good American apple pie. Marcus Chen stood to make a toast, his newspaper having chronicled their struggle from the beginning. "To the teacher who taught us courage," he said, raising his glass, "and to the rancher who taught us that protecting your neighbor protects yourself, may their union be as strong as the community they've helped forge." Others followed, the Martinezes blessing them in Spanish, Jim Brennan offering Irish wisdom, even stern Mrs. Harrison admitting she'd been wrong about the widow Moran. Each toast wove another thread in the fabric that bound them all together. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber, Caleb led Grace in the first dance. They moved together on ground that had seen so much struggle, now transformed into a place of celebration. "No regrets?" Caleb asked, echoing his question from the night of the trial. "Only one," Grace admitted. "That Thomas isn't here to see what his sacrifice helped build, but I think somehow he knows." "He knows," Caleb assured her. "Every child who learns to read, every family that keeps their land, every time this community stands together, that's his legacy too." Liza cut in, demanding a dance with her new brother, and soon everyone was dancing. Old Samuel with Rosa, the Chen children with the Martinez girls, Pete Hawkins tentatively approaching Emma Chen with a shy smile. The barriers that had seemed so solid a year ago had dissolved like morning mist. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit, casting warm pools of light across the gathering. The new schoolhouse stood proud in the distance, its bell tower reaching toward the stars. Next to it, the foundation of a proper teacher's house had been laid, a wedding gift from the community to the couple who'd given them so much. "Time for one more tradition," Samuel announced, producing an old fiddle from behind his back. "This was Clara's. Haven't played it since she passed, but tonight seems fitting." His fingers were stiff at first, but soon the melody flowed, an old song about home and belonging that had travelers wiping their eyes and couples holding each other closer. When he finished, he handed the fiddle to Grace. "For the next generation," he said simply. "Music and learning go together. Clara would want it used, not gathering dust." As the celebration finally wound down, families departing with sleepy children and full hearts, Grace and Caleb stood by the creek one last time. The water gurgled softly, carrying moonlight on its surface, flowing as it had since before any of them arrived and as it would long after they were gone. "We did it," Grace said softly. "We really did it." "We survived," Caleb corrected. "Thrived, even." But the work's not done. Never is, out here. I know, Grace said, leaning into his warmth. But we've got help. We've got each other. We've got a community that's learned to see beyond differences to what unites us. That's more than most folks ever get. They walked back to the house, their house now, hand in hand, behind them. The sounds of the last departing guests faded into the night. Ahead lay all the challenges of frontier life. Harsh winters, uncertain markets, the eternal struggle against a land that gave nothing easily. But also ahead lay the rewards, children learning in a real schoolhouse, families secure on their land, a community that had chosen courage over fear. The West would continue to test them, but they'd proven they could meet its trials. At the door, Caleb paused to carry Grace over the threshold, both of them laughing at the formality of it after all they'd been through. Inside, the house was warm with lamplight and possibility. Their story was far from over. But this chapter, the one that began with a widow and her sister seeking shelter from a storm, had reached its perfect end. This land, this heart, both are yours, Caleb whispered one more time. And mine are yours, Grace replied, forever and always. Outside, the wind sang through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and snow from the distant peaks. The land stretched endless under the stars, harsh and beautiful and full of promise. And in a sturdy house by a clear running creek, two people who'd found each other against all odds settled in for their first night of the rest of their lives together. The West had tested them with everything it had. They'd answered with love, courage, and community. And in this unforgiving land that demanded so much, they'd built something that would last. Not just a home or a school or a ranch, but a place where anyone willing to work and stand with their neighbors could belong. It was, in the end, all anyone could ask for, and it was more than enough. Thank you so much for listening to this tale from the Old West. I hope Grace and Caleb's story touched your heart as much as it did mine. Where are you listening from today? Please drop a comment below. I'd love to know which corner of the world you're in. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more authentic frontier love stories. And share your thoughts about Grace and Caleb's journey. Did their courage inspire you? What was your favorite moment? Let's chat in the comments. Partners,